Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, I'm going to be ranking every single fairy type and see how they do in competitive Pokemon. If you enjoy this type of content and you want to see more like it, leave a like on the video and subscribe for more. And if you want to go the extra mile, click on the links down below for things such as the channel memberships where you can get some extra perks as well as support me monthly, or you can click on the Twitter and Discord, both free ways to support the channel and ways to interact with me as well as get up to date on videos. With that said though, of course, a like and subscribing are also very easy ways to help. They don't require you to really do much else, and comment your thoughts in the tier list down below. It's the best way that I can get your guys' opinions on everything. But with that said, of course, let's get into the tier list and figure out how we're going to be ranking everything today. So for anyone who this might be their first tier list, let me go through really quickly what the criteria is going to be. For the S plus tier, this is going to be for Pokemon that typically dominate, whether it's in the VGC, the Natdex AG Sphere, or the Sword and Shield Ubers/AG Sphere. This way, we can get as much of a basis for doubles and singles as possible in formats that do allow the majority of Pokemon, or at least the most potential of Pokemon. So for example, a Pokemon like Incineroar would probably be an S plus Pokemon because it's one of, if not the best Pokemon in VGC, whereas something, for example, like a Regieleki or a Tapu Koko might not be, because while they're decent Pokemon in VGC, they're not like a top 5 Pokemon by any sense. The S tier is for Pokemon that still do really well in VGC, for Pokemon that still do really well in Ubers or anything goes, but they're not necessarily the Pokemon you think of to define the meta. This would be a Pokemon like Ho-Oh, for example, or if we're going to get into OU Pokemon, maybe something like a later Asterion that is so pivotal in the metagame that it has the potential to really be acknowledged above the rest of the OU tier. For the A tier, this is for Pokemon that are pretty influential as far as just general OU settings go. They were only by Ubers for some bullshit reason, but they don't actually deserve to be there. Or they're for Pokemon that are still pretty decent in VGC, but they're not really meta-defining / top 5 Pokemon. The B tier is for Pokemon that are pretty niche in doubles, they're okay in OU, or they're decent UU Pokemon. The C tier is where we start to lose out on any sort of doubles merit, because there's not really a doubles UU that's actually played a lot, and there's no lower tier for VGC. So we'll start to see some really low tiers singles mons, such as the lower end RU, or the mid end RU I should say, and the lower end UU mons. The D tier is mostly for PU/NU sort of threats, or maybe like a really bad RU-mon, and the F tier is for either NFE Pokemon that are noteworthy enough to mention, or they're for fully evolved Pokemon that are so bad, but I have to tier them somewhere because they're fully evolved and should be recognized as such. So, with that said, let's start off our tier list with Clefairy. Now, Clefairy is not any like really noteworthy VGC Pokemon, but it does have a couple things going for it. For one, Clefairy is unique in the sense that it's one of 2 Pokemon that actually gets Friend Guard, an ability that boosts the defenses of neighboring Pokemon by 0.75, which is honestly incredible. This is a very free defense boost and physical and special defense both that is already applied to your partner Pokemon in doubles. Not only this, but Clefairy also gets a plethora of support moves such as Follow Me, Helping Hand, After You, Icy Wind, etc. that are all very viable as far as Clefairy sets. While Clefairy is never a Pokemon that typically has some insane usage, it's always a Pokemon that finds some way to be at least a niche threat in VGC. I'm going to definitely give this a solid B tier. This is a Pokemon that basically gets better the better everything else is, because you can partner this with something like a Zacian and just make it really difficult to KO, or even a Dynamax Pokemon and make it difficult to KO. It gives its own speed control, it gives its own redirection. This gives a lot of different things. Even something like a Heal Pulse is pretty viable, which I believe Clefairy does get, it's just not as commonly run. The point being is that Clefairy definitely has a lot going in its camp in my opinion, and I really can't see a meta where Clefairy will ever actually be a bad Pokemon, so definitely B tier. Clefable, on the other hand, is definitely an A tier Pokemon. I think there are going to be people who complain that this should be an S tier Pokemon, and to those of you who do say so, I laugh. Clefable is not an S tier Pokemon, it's just a really good OU Pokemon. I will say as well, if there was ever to be an Ubers generation where Clefable was to be actually noteworthy, it's BDSP, just because it's really one of the only fairies that's actually allowed besides like Togekiss and Gardevoir, which both suck ass in a lot of Ubers matchups. This is somehow that's the best that Clefable will ever get in an Uber setting. I know that some people typically like to use Clefable for stuff like Marshadow checking or Zygarde checking. I don't think it's actually that good in Ubers though. Its special defense is not really that high, and typically in a format like that, where so many other Pokemon just have naturally high offenses, it's very easy to actually just break past Clefable. It's not the same as in like an OU setting, where you could typically tailor this to be 3-8 KO'd by most Pokemon because they can't really break it without a super effective hit. It's just kind of mediocre in Ubers, but it is still really good in OU. So I'm going to acknowledge it as such, and I'm going to put it in the A tier. Alola Ninetales is also in the A tier. This is an incredible support piece for VGC and singles. Aurora Veil is really nice support. This opens up Arctozolt, for example, to be an amazing Hail Sweeper in OU because of its stab typing and the fact that it's surprisingly fast in Hail, at least as far as the OU meta goes. But the support is really amazing, and even outside of Arctozolt, this is still really useful for a lot of other OU Pokemon that can typically set up in WinCon. It's really great with Pokemon such as Bisharp that can otherwise threaten teams that might try and defog away the screen. Easy A tier Pokemon in my opinion. Wigglytuff, I'll be honest, I really hate that I have to do this, but I think I'm gonna have to put Wigglytuff in the, I think I'm gonna have to put it in the D tier, but I'm kind of on the fence about it because Wigglytuff does have a couple of things going for it. While it is obviously, you know, a really terrible fairy type, I would say it's arguably better than a lot of others that are at least allowable. But at the same time, Wigglytuff is one of those things that I think only really actually works in very specific PU metagames, and I don't think its current PU metagame is actually really that kind to it in all honesty. Like if we were to look at the PU metagame right now, for example, there's stuff like Deblade, Aggron, Garbodor, Ferroseed, Magneton, all of the, even like Savali, actually no, Savali Steel's banned, but like Weezing and Togedemaru as well, all these Pokemon that definitely give it a hard time. Berserker too, I know Berserker's really good in PU. Even outside of Super Effectivemon, there's some really good breakers like Glastrier or Charizard if you were to get a Sun Up. The point being is that there's a lot of stuff that's better than Wigglytuff. Even fairy-wise, there's stuff like Aromatisse in the tier, so I can't really give this thing a D tier sadly, even with a lot of the stuff it does have. It's basically just a budget clef in my personal opinion, besides terrible ability. But it gets stuff like Stealth Rocks, Teleport, Wish, Cleric moves, stuff that you would think of as good on Clef. It's just worse typing because it's normal as well. So F tier. Galar Rapidash, this is a pretty cool Pokemon actually, in my opinion. Rapidash Galar, while it's definitely still a lower tier Pokemon, this is a pretty good offensive fairy. It's a good physical one too, which is actually pretty rare. While there definitely have been more of the generations, physical fairies are a lot more unique to say the least, because typically a lot of fairies are really defensive and really especially offensive. This is definitely an F tier as well, but I'm going to put it above Wigglytuff at least, just because of how unique it is as a Pokemon. And on top of it as well, as far as a low tier setting goes, this has pretty good coverage for a lot of checks, and it's got the speed and offenses to back it up with like a Sword Dance variation with stabs plus Drill Run. As far as special goes, even its special attack isn't terrible. It's 80, which is pretty good for low tier. And you'll get options like Calm Mind, which in tandem with Psychic, Dazzling Gleam, and Morning Sun or Mystical Fire is honestly really terrifying. So I'm gonna give this a solid F tier, but it's a pretty good one. This will probably be the highest F tier we have. Next up is Galar Weezing. Galar Weezing is definitely going to be a B tier as well. I'm going to put it above Clefairy because it does have a little bit more of a singles presence, albeit not a lot more of a singles presence. But Galar Weezing definitely does have a bit more, considering it is at least a decent RU Pokemon with stuff like Defog and Aromatherapy, as well as just Toxic Spikes, Pain Split. It's basically just Weezing, but it's also a Fairy type. And you guys know that Weezing's not a terrible Pokemon, even still. Even with Power Creep, it's still okay. So Galar Weezing's just a better version of that, and on top of that as well, it's really good in VGC with neutralizing gas, albeit there are some teams that do appreciate regular Weezing a bit more than it, but they aren't exactly, you know, it's not exactly like common to run regular Weezing over Galar. They're kind of interchangeable depending on what you want to check. For example, if you're looking to more so check Zacian, you're probably going to run regular Weezing because this is not, at the very least, Galar Weezing is weak to the steel moves like Behemoth Bash, whereas with regular Weezing, you could probably get off a solid Will-O-Wisp. However, at the same time, if you really need a good Fairy Poison type, Galar Weezing is a pretty good option. So I'll give it B tier. It's still really decent in VGC on certain teams, and even still, it's great in singles. It's a lot better in singles than Clefairy is, so I'm going to give it B tier. Mr. Mime gets F tier. This is going to go above the fucking Rapidash, if for nothing else, the fact that, as I did mention in the other video where I did the bug types, it's a really good Baton Pass Pokemon, and even still, as far as a low tier setting goes, it's still a decent special threat. Stuff like Technician or Filter are both really good abilities on this, especially Filter is really good with Calm Mind sets, though Technician's not horrible. I think this definitely has a lot of potential as far as the low tier mon goes. It's a pretty good trick mon. In fact, this is actually a really fun mon to use if you guys are looking for something in BDSP. I did actually do a vid with this where I showed off Mr. Mime set that my good pal Burial gave me for OU, and it was a pretty fun time. I think Mr. Mime is actually not terrible in that tier. So though, albeit it's not great either. It's a really fucking, like, it's one of those mons you just use for the YouTube vid, but it did okay. But I'm gonna give it F tier. It's still better than Rapidash, I think, in my opinion, just because this has a little bit better abilities. But to be fair, Rapidash's abilities are still decent too. I think as well, just the fact that this does have slightly better support in as far as a double setting goes, but again, neither are really that good. Togetic gets a D tier, if nothing else, for the fact that this has slightly better support than a lot of these mons, and despite the fact this is an untiered fairy, and the others are untiered as well in the F tier, the Violate plus Defog and Roost and support this has is at least, if nothing else, a little bit better than the other mons, because this at least can be a lot bulkier than them because of the Violate. Still not a good mon by any sense, but it's at least significantly more bulky than the other lower tier fairies, and it's still not passive either, which is pretty good. So I'm gonna give this a solid D tier. Azumarill is a pretty decent Pokemon, an absolute menace as far as BDSP goes for breaking power at least. Still pretty decent in Sword and Shield, albeit it's not nearly as terrifying, considering this is only like a UU threat. And as far as BDSP goes, I believe it's also a UU threat. No, it's actually OU, but even still, I was going to say, even if it was a UU threat, it's a meta that has to worry a lot less about a lot of the physical grass types, or even just like a Toxapex meta. It's free of all of those. So I'm going to give Azu, I'm going to give this a high B tier. Albeit, I think there's a case to be made where this could maybe be an A tier Pokemon. But I'm going to lean B just mostly because, unlike, so I know this is a decent Pokemon as far as BDSP goes, but unlike a mon like Scizor, where Scizor was a UU Pokemon in Sword and Shield, but it's like one of the best in BDSP, this is just a good Pokemon, and it is still a UU Pokemon, and it's not like a top UU Pokemon either in Sword and Shield. So I think that overall, the potency of this does definitely go a bit lower, especially when you consider the fact that there are certain metagames where, for double standards at least, where I wouldn't say that Scizor is horrible in, albeit I wouldn't say there's any that it's really stand out either. I think that Azu, on the other hand, though, is a pretty terrible doubles mon, where Scizor at least could be utilized for some sort of priority mon to try and revenge stuff off. So with that in mind, I'm definitely going to give Azu a solid B tier, I think. Granbull's up next. I think if Granbull was in the games, this would actually be a pretty decent Pokemon as far as singles goes. Granbull does have a few things in its camp. For one, it's a really solid fairy that can intimidate, which is pretty unique actually. A fairy that can really support physical bulk is actually amazing. This also has some pretty decent coverage, and it's a really good physical breaker. Again, the physical fairy thing is pretty unique as far as fairy typing goes. It's still got some other good support moves like Heal Bell, and while I really fucking wish it had Stealth Rocks, and while I will forever have the Mandela effect thinking it does get Stealth Rocks, it does not. Still get some good options though, and it's a pretty good offensive mon at the very least. I'm going to give this a solid C tier, actually. I think a Granbull would be... Actually, no, I'm going to give it a D tier, but I'm going to put it at the top at D tier. I think Granbull would be a solid, like, NUPU mon if this was allowed currently in Sword and Shield. Sadly, it's not, and I think it's kind of unfortunate, actually. I think this might also even have some somewhat niche in VGC, albeit I use that very loosely, and it's also exclusively in the not Ubers metas. I think this would be kind of a cool Intimidate option, because it's an Intimidate mon that can handle Landorus while intimidating it back. It's an Intimidate mon that has coverage for Incineroar while intimidating it back. It's an Intimidate mon that is a fairy type, which is fairly unique. It's an Intimidate mon that can have coverage for stuff like Ferrothorn and Amoonguss, albeit it doesn't do a lot of damage to them, but with Dynamax potentially it could. I think it'd actually be a pretty good mon, and I'm actually really curious how well it would have done. It wouldn't have been some like top 5-10 mon by no means, and I only say that because I kept comparing it to really good Pokemon, but I think it'd be at least a niche Pokemon, or at least a usable mon as far as VGC goes. So let me know your guys' thoughts on that if you have any. Regardless though, we have Gardevoir up next. Gardevoir gets a solid B tier. I'm actually going to put this right below Azu. While I know for a fact that Gardevoir definitely doesn't have as much of a Sword and Shield presence, Gardevoir does have a really good BDSP presence actually, as a solid UU mon with actually some pretty decent OU niche. Gardevoir is an amazing Trick Room mon. It's a really good Wish Teleport mon, and Gardevoir in general just takes advantage of the fact that there are so few good fairies, and the fact that this is one of those few Pokemon that actually kept Teleport, unlike something like a Slowbro, for example, which lost Teleport in BDSP. So I gotta give it to Gardevoir. Really incredible Pokemon. It's a great support piece, and honestly, this is kind of a deadly mon with like Healing Wish for Trick Room teams. I think this is personally as good as a Trick Room setter really gets for the UU tier. I know that's probably a bit of an unpopular opinion, but with Gardevoir, for example, if you were to pair this with some sort of Trick Room that like a Snorlax or a Torkoal, for example, I think you could actually get a lot of mileage looking at the current UU tier for BDSP, because really the only switches to that would be stuff like Swampert, which still risks taking on a Torkoal Solar Beam, stuff like Suicune, which could definitely be tailored to be taken advantage of at least, albeit that would probably be one of the more difficult ones. Throw on like a Roserade or a Celebi or something like that, probably Roserade though, or maybe even some RU Trick Room threat. Like, for example, a Vileplume, well, not necessarily a Trick Room threat, but like a Vileplume or even a Vaporeon could be good there. The point being is I do think that Gardevoir could be a really sick UU Trick Room mon. Even still, it's just a great Trick Room mon in general, or a great UU mon in general for BDSP, because really the only actual switch-ins to its stab combination are just like AV Metagross, and if you predict right, you can, I guess, get some mileage out of stuff like Roserade or Drapion, but it's not going to be great for the long term. The point being is it's a very free B tier in my opinion. Mega Gardevoir, I'm going to give this a high B tier. This is a pretty decent Mega as far as stat dex goes, albeit there are definitely a lot of Megas that I do think are personally significantly better. And similar to how I had mentioned in the last video, there was a Mega that I mentioned in Bug type, I think it was Heracross. It's really just unfortunate because of power creep, and that's really all it is. Gardevoir just kind of fell off because of how good the power creep is. There are a ton of really good Megas in that tier, like Mega Latios and Mega Latias. Mega Latias even is actually one of the best Pokemon right now in BDSP, not in BDSP, in Natdex OU, and it's still in anything, and it's still a UUBL Pokemon. So it's just, I think, the splash ability on team comps, it's really all it is, considering even an A+ viable Pokemon is still ranking in the not used tier, but it's still banned from a low tier, which should, in my opinion, say a lot about how good Gardevoir could still potentially be. Gardevoir, while definitely not in the same discussion point because it's not even actually a viable Pokemon, it still has the potential to be, in my opinion. It's incredible typing, it's a really good breaker, good support piece. I just think that sadly the meta is not really kind to it right now with stuff like Keytran and Melmetal in the tier, for example, but it is what it is. Just one of those things where, similar to Raptor, this will just never have a viable meta because it will always be banned from UU. Regular Mawile, shit Pokemon, it's just worse Granbull. I really wish we had Granbull back over this. I'll put it bottom of F tier. The only thing saving this from being the worst fairy that we're going to rank today is Intimidate, which is pretty cool. Mawile sucks. Mega Mawile, on the other hand, A tier fairy. I'm putting this above Clef. Some people might hate me for that, I don't really care. Mega Mawile is an insane breaker, and it's a borderline S-rank Pokemon in my opinion. This is one of those Pokemon that has no legitimate switch-ins because you could tailor this in theory to handle pretty much any switch-in, or at least wear down pretty much any switch-in over time. For example, if I want to wear down Corviknight or Ferrothorn, I can go for Fire Fang, I can go for Sucker Punch to try and revenge off some faster options like Lotties or Zards that might try and KO me, and I can get off some really good damage on them. I can use Iron Head and nail stuff like a Fable or DNC, and I can invest this thing too. It's bulky enough to where you can take hits from a lot of super effective mons. Easy A tier, borderline S. Next up is Mega Altaria, really strong Mega, but again, one of those Megas that, like Gardevoir, got sadly shafted by power creep. Still really good. I would still put this right below regular Gardevoir in my opinion. Incredible Pixelate mon. This is literally jack of all trades as far as Megas go. It can be a really good Dragonet's option, really good Cotton Guard Sweeper, really good support piece, really good just everything mon. And Dragon Fairy is also a pretty fucking insane typing. Easy B tier. Togekiss, really cool fairy, but I think that Togekiss kind of fell off. One thing I will give it though is Togekiss had some incredible usage as far as early VGC metas go, and then Togekiss just kind of fell into the RU range and not really ever used in VGC Abyss because of the restricted Pokemon. So I will give this a C tier. Actually, no, I'm gonna give this a solid B tier. I'm gonna put it right below Clefairy and Weezing though, because if nothing else, those two Pokemon still actually do hold up, whereas Togekiss sadly does not. The one meta that I will give Togekiss is BDSP, but that's more so just because it's one of like 3 fairies that's even remotely competent for OU, because the only other 2 are Clefable and Azumarill. So this doesn't really have a lot of competition as far as a fairy goes. As I mentioned with stuff like Granbull and Gardevoir, the competition is literally non-existent. So I don't really give it a lot of strength there, I'll be honest. And even still, I think if nothing else, at least Gardevoir, in my personal opinion, is more potent in Sword and Shield than Togekiss is. And I think the difference between Togekiss and Gardevoir is honestly pretty minimal here, because I actually think there's a lot more mons in this tier that Gardevoir handles than Togekiss, if I'm going to be looking at the Sword and Shield tier. For example, Togekiss kind of has to be a good Scarf user in this format just because of its typing. I think Gardevoir can get away with stuff like Trick Room to also try and get around teams, albeit, actually, no, that's a lie, because one thing I will give this is Nasty Plot. That's actually a pretty good immediate way to break things. I'm going to put it right above. I think if nothing else, Togekiss does have a little bit better of a time being a physical check to potential offensive fightings. They're both still definitely B tier Pokemon. I think these are pretty interchangeable in all honesty, but It is what it is. Next up though, we have Arceus Fairy, Easy S+, one of the best Arceus forms of all time. It's an incredible fairy. This is probably going to be, in my opinion, the second best fairy we ever, well, no, it's a top 5 fairy. We actually get a lot of really good Uber's fairies as of recent generations. The point being though, is this is an incredibly filthy Pokemon. You could basically run Recover, Calm Mind, Judgment, and then coverage for whatever steal you need to KO, and you'll massacre most teams. Incredibly broken Pokemon, incredible way to take advantage of the 120 around bulk, Easy S+. Mega Audino, this is a solid D tier Pokemon. I'm putting it above Togekiss because I think that Mega Audino actually does have a lot of a good presence. Unlike Wigglytuff, I think this actually takes advantage of the Fairy and Normal typing a bit better because it's recovering Audino from having to be a pure Normal type, which is something at the very least. This has incredible coverage actually thanks to the fact it was previously a Normal type. Its bulk is a lot better than Wigglytuff's. It's a great Wishmon, great support moves. Sadly though, it does miss out on any sort of momentum that Wigglytuff did previously have. But at the same time though, pre-Mega this still gets Regenerator, which is honestly really useful. So I gotta say, I still think that this is a really good mon in my opinion. It's still got some good support moves, easy D tier. Whimsicott, easy S tier. Actually I think I'd give this S+, but I think the competition's a lot higher comparing it to fairies. And even if I did give this S+, it was a borderline S+ mon as far as grasses go. Definitely not S+ when we compare to fairies, because the fairy standard is significantly higher of an entry barrier in my opinion because of how good a fairy typing is. Whimsicott is still an incredible S tier Pokemon though. In all honesty, it's a great prankster mon, it's great utility, it's a good offensive mon, one of the fastest prankster mons in the game. It gets taunt for other opposing Whimsicott or just any other prankster mons that are not named Grimmsnarl or Liepard. Great support piece. It's got a plethora of support moves whether you're going for Tailwind, Taunt, Screens, Charm, Fake Tears. The point being is this was literally made for the Generation 9 format, and it was made like 4 generations ago for it. So easy S tier. Florges, this is gonna be our first C tier fairy. One thing I will say is that I think that Florges is literally just outclassed in every way, shape, or form by the other Spidef fairies like Clefable and Sylveon. But at the very least, this is a lot more egregiously Spidef, which is pretty cool. And it does have Defog, which those don't have, which is something at least that's pretty unique for it. Albeit Florges still definitely has a lot of competition because it's a fairy type that has like no coverage at all. Whereas both the fairies below it and the fairies above it all have pretty good coverage for steals. Clefable has Flamethrower, Gardevoir has Mystical Fire for both forms obviously, Togekiss has Flamethrower, Mega Audino at the very least can hit the electric fairies. I don't think it gets Flamethrower, but if nothing, actually it does get Flamethrower. Granbull gets Fire Fang and Overheat as well actually. So does kind of sit in that very awkward spot of not being able to touch fairies, but Defog is pretty cool on it, and it's still really bulky. You could truthfully just get Wish Protect, Defog, and Moonblast to be fine. So not having coverage for steals isn't really a big deal. You don't really use Florges to be a lure for steals anyway, like a lot of the other fairies. So it doesn't really take a huge knock off of it. It's just the difference between C and B tiers all. Aromatisse, definitely a solid D tier fairy, incredibly valuable PU Cleric mon. It's got some also really valuable Trick Room sets in my opinion, considering the fact that this is able to pull off stuff like Nasty Plot plus Natural Bulk, and Fairy Electric has pretty good coverage for a lot of things, albeit not great against steals as far as the PU steals go, but there are definitely worse fairies around it, like Florges for example, even though it's not legal in this tier. So I'll give it D tier. It's still pretty good. I do think that it sadly has a bit of form weak slot syndrome or a bit of an identity crisis, trying to figure out if it would rather value the especially offensive sets or the support sets. It can do both kind of okay in both regards, so I'll give it D. Slurpuff, pretty cool Pokemon actually. I'm gonna give this actually top of C. Slurpuff's a pretty cool web setter, but sadly webs are no longer as useful. It's a pretty cool belly drum mon, but sadly a lot of things have just gotten faster. Its offenses are pretty good with, 80 offense plus belly drum is pretty valuable, as well as 85 special attack with Calm Mind Citrus sets is pretty valuable. It's a pretty good Sash Webs mon. You can kind of use this in lower tiers to do that. Its Unburden ability is actually pretty valuable with 72 speed. That's probably the best thing about this, but you don't always pop Unburden. In fact, I've actually found it's pretty difficult to pop Unburden in recent gens unless you're going for Citrus Drum, which also just has a hard time getting set up. Still a pretty good Pokemon, and I think that it's one of those things you need to be really careful with how you get it set up, but it can actually be a menace if your opponent does not know how to play around Slurpuff. So I'm gonna give it C tier. Sylveon's an easy B tier for sure. It's definitely gonna go above like a lot of these Pokemon. I'm gonna put it below Ozzy or Mega Guard because these are just outright phenomenal breakers, and Sylveon has no right being in the same discussion as them. But Sylveon is still a pretty potent Pokemon. Despite being an NU Pokemon, I actually do think that Sylveon has a lot going for it. For one, this is actually an incredible Spike Mouth Cup Fairy. It's really good at breaking and not having to worry about Dynamax is incredible for it. Its Hyper Voice being spread plus Pixelate boosted is really amazing when a lot of the Pokemon that are valuable in the tier don't really switch around it. And the few that do, stuff like Corviknight or Ferrothorn, do have to worry about Mystical Fire being ran, so that's pretty good. Sylveon also being a pretty good Baton Pass option to pivot out in that sort of setting is also pretty valuable. Or even just going for something like a Hyper Voice, or not a Hyper Voice, a Hyper Beam or a Quick Attack is pretty good to just try and either pick off something faster or pick off something that's a lot more bulky. So I give Sylveon a lot of props there. It's also a decent specs mon in both NU and RU, to where it was actually so good in the NU setting that even Flygon had to start running Throat Chop for it just to stop Sylveon from being as lethal, which then caused people to just start running Cute Charm Sylveon with Moonblast because they didn't want to care about Throat Chop Flygon, and Flygon still ran Throat Chop because it was that scared of fucking Sylveon. So easy B tier. I know this is tiered really low in Smogon, but it's decent in Spike Mouth, and it's still one of those mons that, similarly to stuff like Quagsire, that it has enough low tier viability anyway, so I do want to acknowledge it as such. It's a good Pokemon. Dedenne is definitely a low end fairy, but I will say that it's at least better than like the Wigglytuff or the Mawile. I think that a couple things that really do give Dedenne any actual merit are, one, the speed tier at 101 is actually pretty valuable, and two, Sheik Pouch is actually a pretty good ability on this. You could potentially farm like a sub Lychee set and try and get this thing boosted, or even like a sub Petaya set and try and get this thing boosted to actually be kind of a threat. Super Fang support as well is pretty valuable, especially when you do farm with this thing with like subsets. You could go with like Subtoxic, Super Fang, and Nuzzle and just try and pull some bullshit shenaniganery. Now, I won't act like this is some amazing Pokemon by any means, it's still pretty bad, but when comparing to these F tier fairies, it's something at least, so we'll give it F tier, but it's not the worst. This mon is the worst though. Terrible Pokemon. The only thing that actually saves this from being an NFE Pokemon in my eyes is the fact that it has sturdy, which is pretty cool, and that it has borderline DNC level bulk, but it's still terrible. It's still horseshit. It's way too passive. It's literally only good for sturdy, and that's it. Klefki's up next. Klefki's an easy A tier. Klefki's, actually, I don't know. I don't remember where I even tiered this thing for steals, but I'm going to give it an A tier for fairies. I think it's definitely better than like the Azu and the Mawile. Actually, no. Klefki definitely fell off as far as VGC goes. It's not like the Grimmsnarl Whimsicott tiering because it's lacking speed control for Prankster. I'm going to put this below regular guard, actually. Klefki is still a pretty good spiker, and it's a pretty good mon in general for singles. I think that sadly it did fall off a bit in VGC because while it does have some good things like dual screens, Thunder Wave, Switcheroo, has stuff like Foul Play, which is pretty good. It has a lot of good support, but it sadly misses out because Grimmsnarl and Whimsicott both have a lot better speed control that's 100% accurate, and also it's speed control for ground types like Landorus and Groudon that you can't exactly just Thunder Wave them. So I can't really give that to Klefki. Sadly, it's a little unfortunate, but it is what it is. Also, Klefki's a lot weaker offensively than both. Also, despite being slightly faster than Grimmsnarl and able to actually take on Grimmsnarl pretty well, Grimmsnarl having priority is just something it has that is entirely out of Klefki as far as an offensive attack, because Klefki has no damaging moves that are priority based, and as far as Whimsicott goes, it's significantly inferior in the speed. Also, Klefki doesn't really have a really great 4 moves in VGC this gen, but it still has the potential to be kind of a niche mon. It's just very, very, very particular. So B tier. Xerneas, easy S plus tier, incredible Geomancy mon. Actually, I'm gonna give Xerneas S tier. I can't lie, this might be a bit of a hot take. I think Xerneas has enough counterplay at this point. Everyone knows how to play around a Xerneas. It's no longer even like a consistent S tier Pokemon in literally any format. For example, if we look at the Anything Goes viability, and we look at Xerneas, Xerneas is an A+ Pokemon because Ditto is a really high value Pokemon, and Zacian plus Duskmane Necrozma are incredible monsters. If we look at, let's say, the Ubers tiering, how good is Xerneas and Ubers? Well, as far as Ubers goes, Xerneas is an A+ Pokemon because it has to worry about stuff like Duskmane and also in general stuff like Ferrothorn, which is incredibly potent in the tier. And stuff like Marshadow is running Scarf or Sash, and it can revenge pretty easily because it can just steal Xerneas' boost. And even still, that's pretty bad in itself. Xerneas has, I will say though, kind of adapted and started running sets for Marshadow such as No Item Polter, or just in general more defensive variants, which is pretty cool actually. No longer relying as much on these Scarf or Geomancy based sets is pretty valuable for Xerneas, and it's a cool addition to try and handle the Poltergeist Marshadow switch-ins. Still an S tier Pokemon, I think. I think the S plus fairies are just infinitely better. For example, I think that Arceus Fairy has a significantly easier time at handling opposing steel types, and our other S plus fairies are just that much more detrimental. Diancie is a solid C tier. Diancie is a pretty cool Pokemon as far as singles goes. It's an incredible NU Pokemon, great Trick Room option, Body Press is pretty lethal on this, great Stealth Rocker, good utility in general in my opinion. It even has a good enough offensive stat to where you could run this thing pretty offensively. It's not a great Pokemon offensively though, but it's better than a lot of other things. I would definitely say that this is at least probably Diancie's best gen in all honesty. It's one of those just really good NU fairies for jack of all trades, but easy C tier. Mega Diancie, easy A tier. Incredible Mega. It's just slightly inferior to Mawile in my opinion, but one of the best things that this gen did for Diancie is the fact that it's now a mixed attacker, and it has better coverage for stuff like Ferrothorn with your Mystical Fire, or just with Body Press in general is an incredibly amazing move, at least pre-Mega goes. And with Diancie, it has such good stats in both ways that you kind of do have to respect the fact that it might not pre-Mega, and it might just go for a Diamond Storm boost or maybe a Rock Polish and take advantage of its bulk depending on what Pokemon's in front of it. So I do think a Mega Diancie is incredible in that regard. It's able to definitely take advantage of a lot of teams because it's so good pre-Mega anyway. Well, it's good enough pre-Mega anyway, and then it's a monster post-Mega. So easy A tier, especially with Magic Bounce. This is an incredibly big monster. Primarina is a solid B tier Pokemon. I'm putting us at the top of B. This is a really lethal UU breaker. It's a pretty cool VGC mon in a lot of different formats, such as Spike Mouth Cup, the non-restricted formats in general. It's great with Hyper Voice. I think it's even had some single restricted formats at least where only one restricted was allowed, where this was kind of viable. But I can't remember entirely on that one. I might be inaccurate. The point being is that Primarina is definitely a good monster, and it's probably one of the better gens that Prim's had for doubles. Water Fairy is an incredible typing, especially with the spread moves that this thing has. It's a pretty good AV mon. It's a great Specs mon. The point being is that Prim is definitely here to stay. Solid B tier breaker. Ribombee gets a C tier. Great web setter. It's one of those mons that, again, it has a lot of viability as far as the PU mon that has great OU viability. The skill swap, the speed swap that this has is also pretty valuable in VGC for stuff like Snorlax, for example. If you're trying to make a really slow mon that can get a lot of bulk in and change its speed tier so it can just snowball past the team, Ribombee's your Pokemon to do so. It also has other speed control, even outside of speed swap though, with stuff like Sticky Webs and Sunspore. Pretty invaluable Pokemon offensively in my opinion. It's even a cool Specs or Quiver Dance mon, so easy C tier. Shiinotic, pretty terrible sadly. I'm going to give it at least above Mawile and Carbink because if nothing else, the typing is pretty okay, but as I mentioned with Whimsicott, it's most beneficial on a fast Pokemon in my opinion. Something as slow as Shiinotic doesn't really actually take advantage of the typing that well, but it's still kind of cool. It has Strength Tap, which is good utility, and stuff like Synthesis also in case if you're fighting a special mon. It's not great though. Easy F tier. Comfey is a decent Pokemon as far as support goes. I'm actually gonna give Comfey right above. I'm gonna give it right above Sylveon, I think. Comfey is definitely one of the better weakness policy poppers we've had this generation. It's great for popping policy on stuff like Gmole or a Veltal, for example, or even offensive dragons like Zekrom and Kyurem. In VGC, this is really amazing with Draining Kiss, especially being +3 priority, which is really useful compared to a lot of other weakness policy mons, because even in Trick Room, you could still get the speed advantage thanks to Triage. You also get some really good support moves like Heal Pulse, or in general, Leech Seed is pretty valuable, but you don't really care about that. And I believe that Comfey also gets Ally Switch. I'm almost certain I found that on Comfey. I know this does also set its own Trick Room, which is pretty cool. As far as the doubles viability goes, actually it doesn't get Heal Pulse, but it does get Floral Healing, which is literally the same thing. So I do have to mention that before some smart ass comments it. But I will say that while Comfey definitely isn't really that great in singles this gen, it's definitely a solid PUmon. This is probably one of the best gens that Comfey's had for doubles. And truthfully, I think that this could even have some really good use in Gen 9, depending on how the meta ends up going with Terastal. Because this could be a really free way to pop policy on basically any Pokemon, depending on what you go with. But this is definitely a pretty solid B tier Pokemon in my opinion. It's one of the better support pieces we've had this gen for fairy types going. It's definitely more valuable in my opinion than Clefairy or Togekiss or Klefki, at least as of right now, and it's been that way for a while. Really the only fairy support wise that outclasses is Whimsicott and Grimmsnarl, but otherwise this is definitely a pretty good monster, so solid B tier. Savali Fairy, one of the better fairy types, one of the better Savali types. It's still definitely a D tier, but it's going to be the top of D tier. Savali Fairy has some pretty good coverage going in its arsenal, but sadly, one thing I will say is that this is a Savali type that really, really wishes that multi-attack was a special move. However, at the same time, SD plus Fire Fang and multi-attack is pretty lethal combination, and it's a good parting shot mon, good defog mon, it's a good support piece. It's even a decent mixed mon, so I'll give it a D tier, but it's just kind of a missed opportunity in my opinion. Mimikyu gets top of C. This is a pretty good trigger mon. It's a little low end as far as fairies go, but it's a pretty good trigger mon in doubles, at least in some situations, as well as the fact that it's a pretty decent low tier Pokemon. Mimikyu sits around the RU range. It's pretty good with just sash sets. It's cool with stuff like deep, well, not sash sets anymore, because sadly sash sets are no longer viable, but it's kind of cool SD mon. You get stuff like Will-O-Wisp, Trick Room, Destiny Bond that are all decent utility options. It's got some good priority in Shadow Sneak too, so it's solid C tier. Next up, we have the Tapus. The Tapus are all going right in, well, let me rephrase that. Tapu Fini, Coco, and Lele are all going right here for pretty similar reasons. In fact, the specific order of it is going to go Coco, Fini, Lele. Actually, no, it's going to go Lele, Coco, Fini. Lele does have one thing going for, no, never mind, because Coco is actually pretty decent in VGC, and it has been all generation. Let me think about how I want to go about this, because I do think a Tapu Coco is pretty decent, but I will say is that Coco's kind of fallen off in the Dynamax metas, and if Finny hasn't, Finny's still really good Ogumon. Final answer, it's gonna go Finny, Lele, Coco, actually. And I think the biggest reason for this, truthfully, is just I think the fact that Finny is one of those mons that's kept up really well, in my personal opinion, as far as doubles goes, consistently through the generation. Coco's kind of had hit or miss moments, and same as Lele, and I think the difference being is that Lele is a lot more irreplaceable as far as a singles aspect goes. Coco isn't. I think they're both pretty valuable in doubles, and they're both pretty much as valuable in doubles, because for Electric Terrain, you're typically going for max boost with Lecky to pop that, and for Psychic Terrain, you're typically going with Indeedee, so I think they're both a bit outclassed in that regard. Finny is still probably the best Misty Surge mon you get though, and it's still an incredible form of speed control, great variety Pokemon with stuff like Misty Seed, Specs, you get Leftovers variants, Citrus Berry, you have a lot of variants with Finny, in my opinion, and it's still an incredible wall as far as Natdex goes too, because it's a great check to stuff like Garchomp, for example, as well as Landorus, Weavile, etc. I think that Lele's up next because it's just an incredible Scarf and Specs mon, and Lele's had a pretty good surgeons because typically the checks that you can run on it are really just stuff like Keytran and Melmetal. They get worn pretty easily over time. Coco's a pretty decent mon still though, and I will acknowledge that Coco still is an incredible Pokemon, but I do think it's a lot easier to check Coco at the very least, offensively speaking. Considering it's pretty easy to check it with a ground type these days. A lot of them don't really get as worn over time. Really, the only one that actually does get threatened by Coco and OU, like, pretty well would be Garchomp, because stuff like Landorus typically is running Leftovers now, and it can long-term check. Stuff like Ferrothorn is a pretty amazing switch into Coco. I think it's just checked by a lot of the same mons that Lele is, but to a bigger degree, because there's more Pokemon that check it. So that's my ratings on the Tapus. I think that realistically though, these three are all pretty equal, and I think you could make a case for any of them being in any order, as I literally had to settle last second on them. But up next is Bulu. Bulu is a pretty decent Tapu still. I'm gonna put it right below Comfey. Actually, I'm gonna put it right below Sylveon, final answer. Bulu's a pretty good breaker as far as a Natdex setting goes, as far as a single setting goes as well. It's a pretty good Umon. The Fairy Grass typing is pretty incredible, and this is 130 attack to take advantage of terrain. As far as Natdex goes, it's even a kind of okay niche Pokemon there because of the Z options, so Bulu still, in my opinion, holds up. I think that people give Bulu too much hate, but it's a solid Pokemon. Easy S tier. Not easy S tier, easy B tier. I was looking at our next Pokemon though, which is a definite S tier, being Magearna. I'm going to give Magearna top of S, actually. I think that Magearna has a significant presence over Xerneas, and I think the presence it has in Ubers, while it's definitely below Xerneas, I don't think that it's enough below Xerneas to where it's outright ranked generally. Well, no, because this isn't a Heart Swap Magearna. I'm thinking of Heart Swap Magearna. If it said Heart Swap, if it said Heart Swap still, it would be ranked above Xerneas, because Heart Swap Magearna would probably put it as far as an Uber setting goes in the solid B+ range, maybe even A-, because it would be a significantly better Xerneas check than Ferrothorn would be at that point. But sadly that was cut, which is unfortunate. And I think the discrepancy here is too high, and Xerneas at the very least still kind of has some cores that do work well for it, especially in the multi-Uber meta. And while Magearna, I think, is one of the best mons in VGC, Xerneas is still pretty good. Magearna, though, is still an incredible AV mon. It's a great weakest policy Pokemon in VGC, cool with berries, citrus, life orb, specs. It's basically jack of all trades as far as item set goes. It's great offensively, it's great bulky. Really, there's a lot of different things going for it. It also sets its own Trick Room or Shift Gear, so it has 2 amazing forms of speed control, and it doubles Soul Heart can pop for any Pokemon on the field. It's not like Moxie or with As one where you need to score the KO. It's just anything. So you can definitely pop some really free Soul Heart boosting sets with Magearna, so I'm gonna give it S tier. Hatterene's up next. Hatterene itself is definitely a solid C tier fairy. I think I'm gonna put it right below Ribombee, well, right above Ribombee, but I'm kind of unsure how I feel about that in all honesty. One thing I will give Hatterene is this is a pretty cool low tier fairy. Albeit, no, actually Fairy Psychic is a pretty good typing on this. This is still a really good Trick Room mon, even outside of Max, albeit it's fallen off a bit because of power creep, but it's still not bad. I think it's just Magearna Surge is really the big thing. Hatterene is still kind of cool though with Psychic Terrain teams, at least, you know, pre-Magearna. I'm going to put it below Togekiss because Togekiss is still definitely the better option here, but Hatterene is pretty good, and it can take advantage specifically as well of G-Max Hatterene, which I'm actually going to put right above. G-Max Hatterene does have the guaranteed confusion max, well, the 50% confusion max move, which is pretty incredible. It does take away Max Fairy, which I actually think is favorable here because it means that you're not taking away your own Psychic Terrain as far as a max move goes. In fact, let me actually double check that real quick because I don't want to sound like an idiot here, but I am fairly sure that G-Max Finale is, actually, I think G-Max Finale is Hatterene's move. But even, not Hatterene's, it's G-Max Smite. Yeah, so it is a fairy move, which is great because you don't take away Psychic Terrain, which is better for boosting stuff like your partner, which is typically ran on a Slice Spam team. You're typically pairing with Indeedee in doubles, which is great because Indeedee can still spam Expanding Force really easily and not have to worry about losing its terrain. And you still get the chance for confusion, which is great because G-Max Smite is a really high damaging move. And you still have options like Mystical Fire for Steel types, which is incredible. So this is a solid, I'm actually going to give this top of B tier. Actually, no, I'm going to give this bottom of A tier. I think this is an incredible G-Max Pokemon personally, and it's one of those few G-Max mons that I think truly does take advantage of how amazing that the G-Max could be. Grimmsnarl's up next. This is an easy S tier Pokemon. I'm putting it right below Whimsicott, and I think it's truthfully because of the fact that I think that Whimsicott has more that it offers as far as utility goes, but they're truthfully pretty even. I know a lot of people probably do value Grimmsnarl more than Whimsicott, and I think it's a fair take. I think Whimsicott just being a faster option, and I think Whimsicott as well offers more valuable utility to a lot of common Pokemon, which I do think is pretty valuable. For example, I think Whimsicott is a better option of taking advantage of Prankster Weather, stuff like the dual fake tears plus charm, helping hand boost, etc. I think are more valuable in a lot of Dynamax Pokemon, whereas Grimmsnarl, on the other hand, I think is more valuable for specifically non-Dynamax Pokemon, being able to boost Light Screen or Speed Control as the anti-Dynamax Prankstermon. These are basically just the antithesis of each other, where you would typically utilize Grimmsnarl for specifically anti-Dynamax, or for preparing your own team against the opponent's Dynamax, whereas you would utilize Whimsicott, and while it could be utilized in that way, just like Grimmsnarl could be utilized as a support piece for Dynamax, you would typically utilize Whimsicott more so to boost your own Dynamax. So they're pretty much like the opposite of each other, while they could both do each other's job as far as what they support best, they have their own preferences, and I think that it's really just a matter of personal preference which is rated higher. I like Whimsicott slightly more. I think it's up for debate though. G-Max Grimm though, G-Max Grimm I'm actually going to put right where G-Max Hat is, just slightly higher. I think that Grimm is typically a mon that doesn't actually care about being a Gigantamax Pokemon, and I think it actually typically prefers not to, but its G-Max is pretty cool at the same time. Being able to go for a Max Snooze with a 50% chance to yawn, which is really incredible. And not only this, but it still keeps Starfall, which is really valuable in Grimm, considering it is a great way to prevent yourself from being burned, which if you're going for Gigantamax Grimm, you should be trying to avoid being burned because you're trying to do damage with Grimm at that point. So I think that that's also, again, another really smart choice of how to utilize the G-Max move in your favor. But at the same time though, I still think it's, again, kind of disadvantageous to actually G-Max Grimm, even if it's a good G-Max. So solid A tier. Alcremie, decent G-Max mon. It's a pretty good support Pokemon with stuff like Decorate. It's definitely the lowest fairy support we're going to have in VGC for sure, but it's a pretty cool one with Decorate on certain teams, and G-Max Finale is a pretty cool G-Max option, being able to give Alcremie some form of recovery even in the G-Max. It's a pretty unique max move too, and it still does some good damage. Both are B tiers in my opinion. They're both tied with each other basically. Regular Zacian and Zacian Crown both get S tier. They're both the top 2 fairies for sure. Truthfully, the same thing I could say about both these Pokemon could be said. They're both incredible physical attackers. It's so redundant actually to even mention them separately, because really the only difference is that base Zacian can run an item, but you typically don't even care about doing so. But even in a format where we disregarded Zacian Crown entirely, Zacian would still be that much better than everything else because of how good Intrepid Sword is, and the fact that you can just run this with like a Life Orb, Band, Scarf, and you're still massacring teams very effortlessly. So they're both S+, they're both the 2 best fairies, undeniably. Enamorus is up next, and I'll be honest, I think that Enamorus regular is a missed opportunity. If we look at Enamorus' moveset, for example, with the PLA Mons tier, Enamorus sadly has the, well, beneficially I should say, has the ability Contrary, which is honestly really incredible. Enamorus being able to have a way to boost its offenses, which it otherwise wouldn't have, is pretty good. However, sadly, it has no moves to really take advantage of this. The only things you could really do that would actually be affected for your own specific use with Contrary would be going for Iron Defense and dropping your own defense. Otherwise, it's specifically for ruining your opponent's stats. And by that, I mean using Contrary to boost your opponent with Mystical Fire, or to boost your opponent's special defense with Earth Power, stuff like that. So sadly, I think that it kind of does miss on something like a Light of Ruin is the move. Or just any way to actually take advantage of Contrary. I assume it will get Superpower. It's a pretty common move on the Genies to get, and that would actually be pretty useful, especially if it also got Acrobatics. That could be really valuable, because a set with like Acrobatics and Superpower with Player Off could actually be a pretty demon set for this mon. It would still get coverage for Steel types and Rock types that are otherwise going to affect Enamorus. It would still be able to take advantage of both stabs physically, and it has some pretty good physical attack. So one thing I will say is I think this Pokemon, even outside of being able to take advantage of abilities, 106 speed and 135 special attack with the coverage it gets with stuff like Mystical Fire, Moonblast, Earth Power, etc., is too good to ignore. So I am going to put Enamorus even still in A tier, and I'm actually going to put it right below Clef. I think this is still going to be a monster in OU, but there's enough fairies that I think actually do outclass it, stuff like the Cocos, DNC, Mawile, Clef, etc. And then Therian form, I'm going to put at the top of C tier. I think a Therian form will still actually be a really good trigger mon as far as OU goes. I think depending on what's viable, it could even be a potentially good Pokemon in OU even. But I think it'll probably be a low UU, high RU range Pokemon. It's a pretty bulky Pokemon, and it has the coverage set again to really just try and AV spam or boot spam through teams with 4 attacks. And I think it'll be a decent Pokemon. 135 is pretty good breaking power, and it's a really bulky Pokemon too. Could take advantage of sets with Combine Draining Kiss as well, and with that natural bulk, could actually be a pretty good Fizdef wall. So I could see this being viable, and I could even see it going to high B, low A even, but right now I don't want to jump the gun on this, and I think that at the very least, this will most likely not be an OU Pokemon. So I'm going to give it a solid C tier. I think it's still a good Pokemon. Actually, no, I'm going to give it a B tier. Now that I'm thinking about it, it's definitely more valuable than like fucking Klefki and Gardevoir. No, not Gardevoir, but Gardevoir and Hatterene too. Yeah, I know this typing is way too good, and honestly, it still has enough coverage. It's like perfect coverage for its weaknesses. It's still a solid B tier. This will probably be a solid U threat now that I'm thinking out loud. Final answer, U threat, Enamorus, Therian. With that said though, hopefully you guys enjoyed the tier list, and if you did and want to see more content like this, leave a like on the video and subscribe for more. Shoutouts to our channel members being Josh K Ultra Player, Mia, and Zeke Zero. If you guys want to become channel members too and support the channel, link down below to that, as well as to our Twitter, Discord, and any other links you'll find useful, including this tier list if you want to make one of your own. And comment your thoughts on the tier list down below. We'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, peace out guys.